the top, we have the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick. Again, it's Mr. Tom McLean that's going to present to us today. Mr. McLean, I think you're familiar with the structure, but I'll turn the floor over to you for 20 minutes, followed by some questions from our members, and then an opportunity for some closing remarks at the end. So we're right on time. I'll pass the floor over to you, sir.
Thank you. And good afternoon. Thank you for your invitation. My name is Tom McLean, and I'm with the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick. After retiring from the software industry, I decided to focus on how the production and use of energy can support climate change action. I've been a part of the CRED-NB community for several years and now volunteer as a member of the core group and the steering committee. Major international institutions point to renewable energy as the most affordable and fastest transition path to a clean energy system. The accelerated adoption of renewable energy confirms that it will be the dominant energy source, and quite possibly the only energy source, in a low emissions world. Today, I will review the evidence which leads to those conclusions and describe how New Brunswick has the natural resources it needs to build an affordable, reliable electrical grid which achieves its greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. This quote from Joel Barker, a futurist and author, is a good description of the state of the energy industry at this time. A paradigm shift is underway as the energy industry shifts from getting energy by burning extracted materials to collecting energy when natural forces provide it. This is the levelized cost of energy for wind, solar PV for the period from 2010 to 2021, as provided by the International Renewable Energy Agency. Even the most leisurely drop is over 50% in the cost of onshore wind power in 11 years. These drops in the cost of solar PV and wind turbines, supported by the dramatic fall in the cost of grid-scale battery storage, have driven their rapid adoption. Lazard Limited reports are an authoritative voice on the global cost of electricity production. The 2023 Lazard reports shows how low the cost of wind and solar have fallen. The NB Power 2023 IRP confirms that those costs are realized in New Brunswick. The levelized cost list in the New Brunswick Power IRP does not include nuclear power, so one might wonder if the cost of NB nuclear power falls in the rather expensive range provided by Lazard. The incredible advances in solar, wind, and battery technology have driven remarkable global rates of adoptions. This graph displays the figures published in the annual World Energy Outlook report produced by the International Energy Agency, or IEA. The black line is the actual amount of electricity generated by wind. The other lines are the IEA projections. This graph shows the amount of electricity generated by solar. The IEA projections were reasonably accurate for wind, seem to be repeatedly too low for solar until about 2017. This graph shows the amount of electricity generated by nuclear. The IEA projections for nuclear were repeatedly too optimistic. The IEA may still be trying to recalibrate its projections in the context of the major paradigm shift underway. Wind and solar have grown so quickly that in 2021 they collectively generated more than nuclear power. The IEA predicts 2023 and 2024 will be more record-breaking years for wind and solar growth. More evidence that a shift is underway. Wind, solar, and hydro will dominate electricity generation as they continue to push out more expensive producers. The IEA 2022 World Energy Outlook describes the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. In this scenario, solar, wind provide 69%, and all other renewables provide 88%. All renewables provide 88% of electricity generation. Yesterday, the IEA published an update to this scenario, which bumped those percentages up to 71% for solar and wind and 89% for all renewables. The Canada Energy Regulator also includes a net zero scenario in their 2023 Canada Energy Futures Report. In this scenario, the generation of electricity in Canada from solar and wind will grow to 30%, and from all renewables to 70% in 2050. The Canada Energy Futures Report and the NB Power 2023 IRP both note if nuclear SMRs fail to meet expectations, then solar and wind capacity would be used to compensate for the shortfall. It would seem prudent to start deploying wind, solar, and storage now to ensure New Brunswick achieves its emission reduction goals regardless. A concern often raised when discussing moving to a 100% renewable grid is reliability. Supply must always match load, no matter what the weather. Here are some of the tools available to ensure an electrical grid remains reliable. This list is based on the Energy Systems chapter in the latest IPCC assessment report. I'll describe each briefly. Demand response is the ability to shift electrical demand or load from a time of peak demand to a non-peak time. The options range from asking customers to manually shift their use of power to automatically lowering the power demand of appliances. Such automatic events would be so brief that customers would not even notice. Transmission both within the province and with neighboring jurisdictions is another key tool. The more diverse the locations of the wind farms and solar arrays, then the more likely it is that at any given time, enough of them are generating power to meet the current load. Energy trading agreements between jurisdictions allow all participants to share in the benefits. Storage is certainly a key ingredient in any strategy to balance wind and solar energy. Although the most commonly used storage in the world is pumped hydro, lithium-ion batteries have an increasingly commanding presence in grid storage. They are cost-effective, modular, scalable, and can even provide multiple grid services in addition to providing 1 to 12 hours of storage. Currently, the largest battery storage site holds 3,000 megawatt hours of energy and can produce 750 megawatts of power. As the saying goes, to make a battery dirt cheap, make it out of dirt. Storing thermal energy or heat in boreholes reduces peak winter loads by supporting district heating of households using energy collected during other seasons. In Canada, this type of storage has been successfully working at Drake's Landing in Okotoks, Alberta for the last 15 years. Also, the University of Toronto is currently in the process of installing boreholes to both heat and cool one of its campuses. More storage solutions are on the horizon, such as electric vehicles and iron-air batteries. A technology called vehicle-to-grid, or V2G, allows EV owners to sell energy back to the grid when the grid needs it. Utilities in Ontario and Nova Scotia are currently piloting this technology. The power utility benefits by not having the upfront expense of buying batteries. EV owners receive payments for providing the service. This service could potentially provide thousands of megawatt hours of storage. Iron air batteries can provide up to 100 hours or 4 days of power and may cost as little as 10 times less than lithium-ion batteries. They are cheap because the main ingredients are cheap: iron and air. In 18 months, the first large-scale deployment of these batteries, 1,000 megawatt hours, will be online in Minnesota. Every grid needs to have reserves. Ideally, those are dispatchable zero-emission generators which are able to fill long gaps in supply and cost very little when not in use. Ever, an Alberta company, has developed a closed-loop geothermal system which is deployable almost anywhere and provides both electricity and heat on demand. The first commercial deployment is underway in Germany and expected to be operational by 2027. Another option is green hydrogen. Turbines or fuel cells use hydrogen to generate electricity without emissions. Just as salt caverns are used to store natural gas, they can also be used to store hydrogen. Producing green hydrogen locally from cheap renewable energy and selling any excess would minimize the cost of supply. New Brunswick has the right geography for salt caverns, and so does Salt Lake City. A facility is being installed near Salt Lake City, which will store 150 gigawatt hours of hydrogen in salt caverns and produce 1 gigawatt of power and provide hydrogen for industrial and transportation applications. The facility will be fully operational by 2025. Note that nuclear power is not a good fit for this role, since to be economical, it needs to be in use almost all the time. As this graph shows, countries are learning how to integrate large amounts of wind and solar into their grids. Denmark has the highest level, but at 61%, they're actually off the top of this chart. Some states have also integrated large amounts of wind into their electrical grids. Wind generated 55% of the electricity in South Dakota in 2022. In Maine, 27%. In Texas, 24%. The leader is definitely South Australia, as it set a record in December 2022 by running for over 10 days on just wind and solar power. New Brunswick has an abundance of wind for electrical generation. The red, yellow, and orange areas on this map have annual average wind speeds which are sufficient to generate power economically. Yves Gagnon, an accomplished professor of engineering at the Université de Moncton, identified over 41 gigawatts of New Brunswick wind power potential in a 2008 study. For comparison, the peak power load in New Brunswick last winter was 3.7 gigawatts. The provinces of Atlantic Canada have lots of wind power to share and trade to balance the grid. Although not as potent as the wind resource, the solar potential in New Brunswick is still significant. The south half of the province has capacity factors which fall well within an economic range. Many tools are available for the transition. Efficiency, minimize the amount of energy needed by continuing to deploy and support efficiency measures such as heat pumps and better building insulation and sealing. Diverse locations, deploy wind farms and solar arrays in diverse locations, so most of the time sufficient sites are producing power to match the grid load. The Energy and Environmental Economics Study referenced in the New Brunswick Power 2023 IRP speaks to the benefit of balancing wind resources across a broad area, to maximize diverse load, negotiate energy trading agreements with neighboring jurisdiction, and deploy the infrastructure, such as the Atlantic Loop initiative, to support them. Demand response, provide a range of options to customers to enlist their help in beating the peak and ensure they share in the benefits. Storage, monitor storage technology developments as costs and technology options are changing rapidly. Identify opportunities to deploy robust district heating solutions to capitalize on cheap thermal storage and closed-loop geothermal. Green hydrogen as a resource. Investigate the potential for generating and storing our own supply of green hydrogen as a grid reserve. Green hydrogen is an expensive commodity, but carefully planned production, storage, and power generation could provide a clean and cost-effective grid reserve. Here are some ways to ensure we all move forward together. First Nations engagement. Work in partnership with First Nations in the planning and deployment of wind, solar, and storage sites. Community engagement. Deploy a community-sensitive process for deploying grid scales wind and solar. See the November 2022 study, Why Do Wind Energy Projects Fail? From the Conservation Council of New Brunswick. Also, continue to support community and household wind, solar, and storage to improve system robustness and increase public support. Atlantic Canada Cooperation. The Atlantic Canada region has a wide selection of diverse locations for generation of power from wind and solar. Deploying sufficient transmission capability through initiatives such as the Atlantic Loop is key to maximizing the synergy, which brings more reliability and lower costs for all. Over the last decade or so, the cost of wind and solar electricity generation have fallen dramatically. Globally, wind and solar have become the most economic choices among all types of electricity sources, both clean and not. Many countries and states have embraced these technologies and are already integrating large shares of wind and solar onto their electricity grids. Even the world at large moved from less than 2% in 2010 to 12% in 2022, and that pace is accelerating. The trend is clear that renewable energy will be the dominant energy source and quite possibly the only source in a low emissions world. New Brunswick has the renewable resources needed to power its electrical grid. By working cooperatively with its neighbors, New Brunswick can build an affordable, reliable electrical grid which achieves its emission reduction goals. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. McLean. Great presentation. We'll move right on with our round of questions, beginning with our official opposition. Looking over, Mr. Lepage.
Merci. Thank you, Chair. One thing that popped into my head that I didn't understand or didn't have enough information is when you talked about the underground storage and you used a burial, I didn't understand what it was. Can you explain to me a little bit more about that option that you see?
Salt Lake City, the salt caverns, or the thermal storage?
The thermal storage I'm aware of. It's the other one that I wasn't.
Okay, so the currently natural gas is they store that in underground caverns. It's a very inexpensive way to store natural gas. And so the technology of storing gas underground is not new. That's a well-used process. And in fact, there are some very small sites where they store hydrogen exist currently right now as well. However, this is looking at storing hydrogen in large quantities underground. And the reason for they store it underground is it's very cheap to do it, very stable, and if you're in the right geography, very easy to do. Now, New Brunswick does have the right geography. We have salt deposits, and so therefore we can actually create, if they don't already exist, salt caverns to actually store very stably, very safely, and very cheaply large amounts of hydrogen. Now, green hydrogen is expensive to create, so it's not a great thing for meeting baseload, for example. But if you're looking to have something that you need to tap just in case, and it has to always be there, and you want it to be low emissions, then either burning hydrogen in a combustion turbine or using a fuel cell to generate electricity, those are very good ways, that low emissions or zero emissions, and very dispatchable. And the main thing is that when they're not in use, it's very cheap, very cheap.
Thank you. And most of your studies or your when you were comparing different countries, I was looking first of all at the weather situations in their countries versus our little New Brunswick and our weather differences that they have from Australia, let's say. We don't have the same temperatures and same conditions. Wind and solar, can you give us some proof that they are reliable for season?
This is happening very, very quickly, of course. So and as I've learned, in science there is no proof, there's just evidence that supports it. So I cannot prove it, but the evidence is mounting that yes, we can do it, because I tried to pick a wide range of countries in Europe and below the equator, and also the fact that if I point out Drake Landing in Okotoks, Alberta, it's not, it's in Canada, it's not near the North Pole, but it's still in Canada, and it gets, the climate in Okotoks is about the same as the climate in Fredericton. And so they've been using their thermal storage there in their boreholes for 15 years. And they've found that by and large, in most winters, the heat they've stored is enough to get through. Now, they do have gas heaters as a backup. So you need to have some sort of backup for sure. But you can remember, 15 years ago, they didn't have the heat pump technology they have now as well. So it's quite possible to, with today's heat pump technology and today's technology improvements around borehole technology and whatnot, that's not a problem. But that is the evidence I have, but hard to find proof at this point.
And that's probably because of my French translation of proof and preuve et évidence. That's probably where I made the mistake in the wording, but I got my answer. Thank you very much. When you say that we've got the natural resources needed in New Brunswick, can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because when we talk about natural resources, we think about water, air, and land. Can you give us some more details on your interpretation of natural resources?
The dominant production of electricity in the world is going to be solar and wind. And so the question is, do we have enough solar and wind to do that? And Yves Gagnon, he did that study back in 2008, where he said, oh, we have 41 gigawatts of wind potential. And how much does the province use at its peak? 3.7. So the raw energy that we can gather from wind plus solar is many times more than we need. The question is always, can we get it when we need it? That's always the question, right? Because nature decides when they're going to provide it, but we decide when we want to use it. So the challenge is always the integration part. And that's why I listed out a number of the tools that are available for integrating power, for balancing, like storage and demand response, transmission. All those tools are needed. And the question is, then for us in New Brunswick is, What's the recipe for us? We have all these great tools that are here, that are available, that are low cost. So what's the recipe for us to make sure that our grid is going to work well for us, is low cost for us, and of course, positions us to meet our low emissions goals?
All right, I still have a few minutes, and I was quite aware of Dr. Gagnon's study in 2008. One of the critics that we had back then was transmission lines were not there, and also the acceptability from the citizens around the points that he was focusing on. People don't want a tower in their backyards. So those were the two major concerns. Well, some of the concerns were back then. So public acceptability, solar, I think it's easier to pass because you can do it on your house, on your business, or on a community level or a farm, more of a solar farm. I've seen plenty of those. But the towers are always one of the questions that are a little bit more fragile in the public perspective or the way that they see it, because of the noise, the sight, the possible impacts on birds and all of that. Have you seen a switch from 2008 until now for public acceptance of wind turbines?
I can't comment on the switch myself. I do know the technology has improved, just for starters. Wind turbines that were produced 20 years ago were much more noisy than they are now. So now it essentially comes down to the sound of the blade slicing through the air, which is the noise. And also they're far more cognizant of things like flicker, for example, where the blades are blocking the sun briefly and causing a flicker, which can be incredibly annoying. So all these advancements have been made, and improvements in zoning and regulations to make sure that wind turbines are not disruptive to people. And also, the other thing about wind turbines, you need to have community acceptance. So you need to make sure the benefits are there for the community as well. Now, previous presenters talked about, for example, microgrids. Well, with turbines, solar arrays, and today's storage technology, then you can all of a sudden support microgrids. Well, why is that important? Well, all of a sudden, then as a community, you have a much more stable electrical system, which is more robust in the face of increasingly severe weather events, and you can drive down your costs of your power as well. So those types of things, decentralizing our grid and generation, actually have benefits to the community. But those things need to be explained. No question about it. All of a sudden, if there's a tower in my backyard, what's going on? So yes, and that's why I do draw your attention to the study that the Conservation Council in New Brunswick did that actually speaks to some of the reasons why wind turbine projects have failed.
That's all my questions. Thank you very much for being here and for your interest also in green energy. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Lepage. And not seeing any further questions from your side, I'll move on to the government side. There's a couple minutes.
Clock from
Oh,
here
by the
sitting
way.
in front of me. Oh,
Mr. Arsenault,
yes, I
got a
wouldn't
couple
mind.
minutes.
I'm just wondering, would there be an advantage when you talk about green energy and that to have a regional strategy like Atlantic Canada or the maritime provinces? Do you see that as a possible advantage, or should we just go on our own?
I'm not an expert on this, but from what I've seen, it looks to me like we have a lot of advantages in doing something like that. Because a big part of balancing wind and solar is drawing across a large geographic area. Now, obviously, you have to balance that with the cost of transmission, obviously. But the larger the area, the more likely is that the wind's not blowing here, it's blowing here. So Yes, I think there can be a lot of advantages to that, and different areas can be better suited for wind, different for solar, different for storage, all kinds of possibilities where people can trade off, or organizations can trade off, jurisdictions, their specialties, what they're better suited to do. So I can see that being not only from the diverse locations, but also from the perspective of leveraging one set of system operator, for example, controls across a large area.
How about changes to the grid? By the way, I consider you an expert. Don't undersell yourself. But how about changes to the grid? Are the utilities, especially the one in New Brunswick, the NB Power, are they able to move and to pivot to make these things happen and make sure that the grid can take it, or is there a lot of investment necessary to have some mini grids built or things of that nature, some different type of grids?
In my opinion, what needs to happen is a strategic plan on what's the best mix for us in terms of transmission, storage, and where it's generated. It's finding the right recipe for us. So when you talk about transmission, absolutely, NB Power can make sure those things are in place. But they have to have the right supports, and they need to have the right mandate to make those things happen. So whether the Atlantic Loop is almost a hot word, because what does that mean? Well, I think in my definition, it's like a concept. And the concept is, what's the best way of organizing transmission within Atlantic Canada so that all participants, all partners are benefiting?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arsenault. We'll move over to government side. Minister Crossman.
Thank you, Mr. McLean, for the presentation. It's very educational, learned a lot, and very clear presentation. Appreciate that very much. And certainly, you're absolutely right, looking for the best mix of energy resources. Moving ahead, a couple of quick questions here. How would you suggest that communities be engaged in a clean energy future, New Brunswick communities?
Wow.
I know you touched on some of that with collaboration and working together.
Yes.
But you could elaborate, maybe.
I think that I think people in New Brunswick are already on board with the need to move ahead on action for climate change. I think, but what has to go hand in hand with that is making sure that as we make changes, people understand why those changes are like that, and also they can understand they can get the benefits on the ground as well. I think it's important that as we roll this out, we need to understand, first off, changes cost money, no question about it. And so we're going to have to invest in those changes to get to a different state of play where we actually are going to be saving a lot of money because the production of energy is cheaper. So how do we make that happen? And we need to explain to people what that's going to look like, and on the ground, how they're going to not only benefit from the fact there's going to be less pollution in the air, but also from the fact there's going to be less expensive electricity eventually, or maybe not less expensive, but at least not as expensive as it could go, and also why these changes are going to help bring about a more robust system. Nothing worse than having no power in the middle of winter because you've just been hit by a severe storm, ice storm, you name it. So part of the benefits I think we need to build into this is not necessarily just cheaper electricity, as your previous speaker said, that may not be the best solution, but I think what people really want to make sure is they're secure, that they know they can heat their home in the middle of winter. And that's why decentralization, like thermal storage in the ground and whatnot, those things can go a long ways to making sure that not only do we have a good grid, but where you are in your home, you can be rest assured that you're going to be safe and warm.
Sure. Thank you very much. Have you given thought to the underground storage in the Sussex area, the former potash mines, which are salt caverns as well? Any thoughts on that one, or location?
That has come to mind. I haven't got a lot of thought beyond that, but yes, it's just an example of why we are amazingly blessed to be able to do something like this.
Yes, you're right, it's already, it's already in place. And maybe a little bit of background too, you talk about social acceptance, you're absolutely right. Some places are fine with the wind farms, but not in my backyard sort of thing. And we've faced that in the province as well. But also on the more recent one, maybe Birch Hill Wind Farms, there wasn't a peep. It was all good. I don't know how many towers are there?
10.
10? I drove by them on the weekend, and you see them, you don't hear them, they're well located, follow new guidelines, and I like the way you put it too, that they're not as noisy as they used to be. That was always a problem, right? And birds and everything else. Any idea of how many wind farms or turbines in the province? Is there a number? I know there's more in Sussex area too, Penobscot.
Although we have, sorry, I
Just
don't have that
per-
number
per-
off the top of my head, sorry.
No, but it is increasing, slow but sure?
I know that NB Power has put together is looking for another 270 megawatts. But I would hope that with a strategic plan for the province, we would actually deploy, every year, we should be deploying solar and wind turbines. I'm not sure that's the case.
Right? And we're talking on land. How are we for offshore?
Well, on land, of course, is less expensive, so that's certainly a big benefit for on land, and of course, it's faster. Offshore has some interesting benefits. First off, it's more expensive, but that cost, I don't know if you remember the earlier graph, but
Yeah, I
that
do,
cost has come down quite a bit, and it's actually getting fairly close to for onshore, which is somewhat surprising even for me. I've been looking at it for a while. And that's because of some of the things like some of the wind farms on offshore can now be floating, as not just fixed point.
No.
And also with offshore, you tend to have a higher capacity factor. The wind blows more often, which also helps to drive down the cost, keep the cost down. And the other thing, interesting, almost strange benefit of being offshore with the fixed ones, is that they can actually provide an artificial reef for fish and whatnot. So it actually improves harvests for fishermen as opposed to the other way around. So it's a strange offshore benefit. Now, I think offshore, I didn't include it in any of my resource pictures for New Brunswick, but it is there. And I think that at some point we will want to capitalize on it, just as another part of the recipe that's right for New Brunswick.
We discussed this morning about supporting the province through employment, manufacturing, whatever. I remember 10, 12 years ago, from the Port of St. John through to Albert County, early morning, anyway, all the materials going. Where are they being built, most of these turbines? Obviously Europe?
Europe, yes, is a big, I can't remember off the top of my head, but Europe and US. And I wonder, why aren't we thinking about building more of them here? I mean, if you have, they're going to be installing lots of wind turbines. In fact, a number of these technologies, it isn't the market, it's the supply that's the problem. So why don't, I think that we should be thinking about, well, if there's a huge market for them, and we know we're going to be part of that market, why aren't we considering, if not building them, at least building key components for them here?
That's right. Regarding the your solar solar farms and whatnot, is there also a steady increase in the province? I know some large areas of some farms have them, and is that growing slowly too?
Growing slowly. Again, I think that we really need to pick up the pace. Solar is a good complement to wind because there tends to be more solar in the summer and less wind in the summer. And of course, you get solar every day, maybe not as much as you might like, but wind, you may or may not get it. So it's a great complement. But again, I think part of this process of rolling it out is that it takes people to do it, and we want to have people here to do it, and we want to keep them here. So that's why I really strongly urge us to be deploying wind and solar every year So that workforce that we want to attract, train, and keep here is actually there and continues to be here, so we can roll it out without interruption.
Right. I do think there's an increase in the residential solar panels in the southern part of the province, St. John area. I'm seeing more. I was invited one day, a couple years ago, to Quispam Sis. The gentleman wanted to show me his house. He's paying $25 a month for his home, but at the same time, it costs $40,000 to install it. So that's a big deal, right, with cost-wise?
That's a big deal.
We also touched this morning on tidal energy. Do you have any update through you folks as to where we are with that, or is there anything going on for studies or
Tidal
updates?
energy, I'm almost inclined to put that into the wild card category.
Yeah, I know.
It seemed like such a, like it had so much promise, but it doesn't seem like the Bay of Fundies are willing to let anything remain there in one piece. So it still has certainly potential. I've heard it could be 1 to 2 gigawatts of power could be generated from the Bay of Fundy. But yeah, at this point, I think it's a little bit of a wild card.
Okay, thank you. I'll change over a bit. In your view, how can New Brunswick encourage the storage for renewable energy? How can we encourage it?
Encourage, sorry?
The storage of renewable energy.
The storage is essentially the glue that's going to keep renewable energy together. And previous presenter talked about the fact that in California they got storage because they were throwing away these electrons from their solar arrays because they didn't need them at a particular time. So it was basically putting free energy into a battery. And so I think the economics are really going to speak for themselves very quickly as the cost of battery storage continues to drop. As I mentioned, the cost of this on the horizon iron air technology is about to implode the cost of storage. Then it's really going to be making sure we're not curtailing any of that really cheap renewable energy. And so storage is really going to be a bit of a no-brainer. The question is making sure we didn't buy a bunch of storage today and it goes on sale tomorrow. But it's more the fact that we have all these options. They're available now, and they're going to continue to be economically even more attractive as time goes on.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll close there, Mr. Chair, to keep us on schedule.
Very good. Thank you for your questions, Minister Crossman. We'll move over to our third party, and Ms. Minton, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here this afternoon and for your presentation. You've certainly covered a lot of ground, so I'm going to jump around a bit, but I think I'd like to start by asking for your comments on a bit of a big picture question. As you were just saying, the technology's there, the cost is dropping, and we know there's often quite a bit of funding out there, and that the ROI for investing in these technologies, these safe bets that keep coming up, there's evidence that that's a good investment. So can you speak to what you think is keeping us from moving forward? What's getting in our way, and what's needed to move forward faster in this direction?
Well, it always comes down to money, doesn't it? Money is the key issue. As I mentioned before, change is cost. There are costs to transition of any type, and even when you see over the mountain, over the horizon, there's a much better state you want to be in, and you want to get there, but of course you have to fund the trip there. And so I think part of this is ensuring that we have the policies in place that were consistently supporting the rollout of solar arrays and wind turbines and the storage and other solutions that are needed to integrate them, not only as a policy, but also ensuring that NB Power, our utility, our homegrown power, we want to make sure that they have the mandate to roll out a plan that shows us growing this resource, this renewable resource, on a steady basis, steady, maybe even accelerating. Because if you look at the world and other countries, it's moving in that direction. There's nobody's guessing or second guessing that the world is going to solar and wind. So we know that when we're to get there too, we're going to have a range of support and off-the-shelf pieces to make that happen. The problem is making sure with the policies, the mandates, and the direction to our utility to get there.
Okay.
That's going to be key.
Thank you. That's something that has come up multiple times. Ensuring there's the available financing and investments, and then having ambitious goals and mandates, legislated mandates and goals ideally for achieving these things. Thank you. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more to the solar potential in New Brunswick. I'm not sure, there was a slide in here, I'm not sure if you have more information in front of you around the solar potential here.
Lazard gives a range of costs for solar, and so all those are attractive. New Brunswick tends to be towards the higher end of that range. So that's why it's not our first choice. Wind is definitely our first choice. More than enough wind. Solar is still a good choice, especially in terms of complementing wind. Because with renewable energy, you want to make sure you have a nice array of different choices to fill in the gaps, to making sure that no matter when you need power, there's probably something providing it, right? So the solar potential in New Brunswick is good in the southern part of the province. As you go further north, it gets less and less. Now, there's all kinds of ways to improve that. Solar technology itself is improving, and you can use tracking arrays, all kinds of interesting ways to tweak that. But as a general statement, that's where solar is for New Brunswick.
Okay, thank you. I'd like, if you can address this, for you to speak around community engagement and maybe even community-owned assets. This is, I think, an obstacle or an opportunity, depending on what happens, but I'm wondering if you can speak to that issue, please.
Yeah. In my opinion, I think community-sponsored or owned assets are a great opportunity because it gives benefits to the community, it provides robustness, and it provides ownership and buy-in and engagement of the community into the solution. They're not just having a solution thrust on them, they're actually being part of the solution. So there's this whole thing about should we have open markets or not and whatnot. That gets into a whole other area about electricity generation. But in my mind, having communities that say, I want to have I want to be part of the solution, and I want to make sure I'm benefiting not only generally, but specifically from the solution as well. And so how do you fund that? What's the magic secret for funding it? I don't know. If I had the magic secret, I'd give it to you. But I think that makes a lot of sense because in various communities, renewable energy can be a lifeline. For example, a little bit different, but for farms, for example, a wind turbine on a farm takes up almost no land. It's next to nothing. It's a little dot. But the supplement to their income can be huge. The solar arrays, as I showed in my last slide here, they can go onto farms and not only are nice companions for sheep to provide shade and whatnot, but also there are many crops that prefer shade. So actually having a solar array that makes money for you as well as providing you with shade to encourage your crops, harvest, having a better harvest is a bonus. So there are ways to actually to look at each situation and figure out how can this not only give you a benefit from the electrical standpoint, but other fringe benefits as well.
Okay, thank you. I've seen examples of solar arrays in parking lots where it provides shade for the cars, and it's just this space there anyway, and it prevents too much heating of the asphalt anyway. So yes, we can be creative, I guess is part of the point. I think that when we're having these discussions, sometimes it gets into sort of silver bullet technologies. Wild cards is one of the terms that keeps coming up. And sometimes we forget about some of the infrastructure, like you were talking about storage and microgrids, and how the system may need to look different. You talked about decentralizing and diversification. Could you speak a bit more around microgrids and storage, I guess, as well, please?
The concept of a microgrid is the idea that an area is essentially providing pretty much its own power. And but it's connected to the major grid, the main grid. And so that normally, in the normal run of the day, they're generating power. If it's too much, then it goes off to the grid. If they need a little bit more, it comes off the grid to the power, to the microgrid. And but it gives that community some control over their costs and the security of their grid and electricity. So the idea is relatively new, but it's certainly gone back at least a decade for sure. The computer and the controllers that are available now to implement these things are getting much more sophisticated and easier to use as well. For example, Summerside has a microgrid. So they actually they have it implemented there. The idea is that it gives more control back to the community, both in terms of their grid, and also it gives more robustness to the system. So if a major generating station goes down, then you've got a lot of people that are out of luck. However, if one turbine goes down, that's 5 megawatts, you can probably find it somewhere else. So the idea with decentralized production, it actually makes your grid much more robust. So it can handle hits here, there, and in other places without having major impacts. So the idea behind microgrids is that you have them sprinkled throughout the province. Then if there's a hit to somewhere, most likely those microgrids can still stay up and keep on functioning. Right? In fact, part of the modularization that often comes up is at some point a company is going to say, we're going to modularize the concept of microgrid, and we're going to say, oh, you want a microgrid? Okay, here's 3 wind turbines, here's 2 megawatts of solar arrays, here's a battery, and maybe some thermal storage, we'll throw that in, boom, there you go. And now you're a microgrid. So it's not going to be quite that simple, but the idea is that you could actually make it an off-the-shelf technology, so the community can just say, I'll take one of those. And so what happens then, it goes from being a customized insertion into a community or village, which is being forced on them, to something to say, yeah, we'd like one of those, but that's going to save us money, we're going to give us more control over our destiny, and it's going to help us be part of the climate change solution.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. My time's almost up, but this idea of, again, this decentralization, and even yesterday we were hearing about distributed energy resources, and all of this seems to be an important piece that our committee should keep in mind as we're making recommendations to the legislature about this long-term planning and needing to think differently about the way we've been doing things. I want to thank you for your time, and the clock has run out, but thank you for being here today.
Yes, and thank you, Ms. Minton, for your questions, and Mr. McLean, thank you for being here and appearing today. It was a great presentation, and thank you for responding to all of our members' questions. If you'd like to take a moment and make a few brief remarks, I'll turn the floor back over.
Yeah, thank you again for the invitation. It was my pleasure to be here. I do hope I've helped to contribute to the pool of knowledge. I try to use the best authoritative and most credible sources I can, because obviously there's a lot of information out there. You want to make sure you're using the best. If any members want to follow up with me to get more information about my references in terms of what I've used, or any other questions at all, the committee clerk has my contact information. Be more than happy to respond. And thank you again.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate that offer. And again, thank you for your appearance.